This morning I turned off my mic, didn't I? Sorry about that. This morning we have heard the next installment in the Exodus story. Last week we heard the story of the Ten Commandments being given to God's people in the wilderness. And today we hear a story that may seem a little odd at first. It's basically that Moses has gone to be on the mountain with God as he has been commanded to do. He has been gone for 40 days. And in his absence, the people have felt abandoned by God to such a degree that they have decided to ask Aaron to cast a god that they can worship. And he takes all of their gold and he puts it into the fire, and out comes this golden calf that they begin to worship and celebrate. And so Moses is up on the mountain, and God says, "Moses, hurry back. Your people are committing a great sin. They are worshiping this golden calf." And then we get to this part where I have a head-scratching moment, because God threatens he says, basically, "Moses, would you like a new group of people? These people don't seem to be working out so well." He's angry. God is angry. And Moses, therefore, takes the position of, no, don't do that. Let's give them one more try. And when I think about that in light of the promise from Genesis after the flood and the ark and the rainbow, in which God promised never again to bring destruction, my wondering, and I'll never know if this is true or not, but I wonder if God wasn't acting like a member of the debate team, taking one side of the issue so that Moses would have to take the other and make him realize that, no, he really doesn't want to get rid of these people. He really does care for them. So whatever the case, Moses persuades God not to wipe out these people, and he heads back to try and bring them back into line. And if this story is read just as it is without any context, it can seem like a real head scratcher, doesn't it? I mean, here these people have been delivered out of slavery, have been given manna and quail, have been given a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire that they might know God's presence, and yet they are feeling like they are abandoned. They are feeling like they don't know God. They don't have any sense or assurance of God's presence. And the truth is that, whether it makes sense to us or not, their experience is that they are struggling to believe that God is in their midst. Yes, by day they see a cloud, but, a cloud obscures the vision. It doesn't really bring a lot of clarity. And yes, they see fire, but fire defies touch. There's no sense of being able to really touch this God. And so for so long, they feel they have not seen God's face or heard God's own voice. All they have had is Moses. And they have asked questions of God by speaking to Moses, and Moses has become their living link to the hidden presence of God. And now Moses is not there. In essence, they are no different than many of us. They would very much like for God to be in a nice box that they can understand, and they're getting anxious that God is not staying in this box. And so Aaron gives into this and ironically uses the gold that they have stolen from the Egyptians in order to cast this image of this golden calf. The golden calf being because that ties to another religion in the region at the time. And so here they have something that they can see and touch, and they want to believe that God is present with them in this way. Here's the thing, though. It's not real. And that's the thing about idolatry, is that as much as we may feel in control, as much as we may like things to be in a certain way and think, oh, finally, we've gotten our lives just the way we want them to be, whatever that is, that's really not how God works. God is beyond us and above us and works in ways that we don't always understand. Certainly, if God listened to all of my opinions, the world would be much different. Am I right? I'm sure it would be in your sight as well. And so I can understand a little bit more when I think it through from that perspective of how the people end up in this position, how they think that this sounds like a good idea. And so as Moses returns to the people, I have to wonder what it was like to try again to find that hard way forward, the kind that reckons with the divine presence that won't be controlled, that won't conform to what we wish it would conform to. What was it like to try and rebuild that sense of community that surely felt broken, violated, that trust had been lost? You know, the people feeling like Moses had abandoned them, Moses feeling like he must be a pitiful leader if the people would just run off after a different God after 40 days. I'm sure there was a lot of difficult feelings. And yet, the living link between us and our God continues to remain present and active. I thought more and more about what it must have been like for Moses. He pleads for mercy on their behalf, so clearly he is feeling very attached to and responsible for these people. And in this sense, even though I'm nowhere close to Moses, I can identify with how he's feeling. I know what it is to love a group of people, to love a community of faith, no matter what, no matter how many times we, hurt each other or do things that don't make sense to me. You all are my tribe, and no matter what, I love you. And I could imagine that Moses was feeling much the same. And I can also sympathize with the fact that the people were feeling abandoned at some level. Maybe they wish there was another community in the wilderness they could transfer to, somewhere else that they could go and maybe find a better leader. And that's part of the nature of our culture today that we struggle with, that we are so accustomed to being able to return something we've purchased if it doesn't work out the way we want it to. We're so accustomed to changing service providers that if we don't like, this cable provider, we'll switch to another one. That we tend to think of our church lives as falling into our consumer assumptions. And the truth is that we are much more than a good or service. We are a covenant community. We are a people that God has brought together for God's own purposes. And we are much closer to a family. We are a family than we are of any other thing that we experience in our lives. Today, we have the great honor of receiving new members into our community of faith. And as Marianne and Brian and Alberta take their membership vows, there's always a part of me that wishes that I could inoculate new church members. And the inoculation would be against future disappointments. Unfortunately, all I can say is that I promise that at some point you will feel let down or disappointed, because we're all humans here. And as much as we enjoy the community that God has created here, as blessed as we are so richly and deeply, there are times when we let each other down. There are times when we hurt each other. And in those times, the question before us is always, will we do the work necessary in order to find our way forward together, work through our hurts, and be the community of love and forgiveness that we promise again this day in our covenants? Or will we simply give up and try to find a different religious service provider? Or maybe just give up on the service altogether? The challenge of being in community is to love God and allow God to teach us to love others in such a way as bonds form that hold us together, especially in times of trial or trouble or disappointment. And I was reminded of a person in my last church. And she is a person of amazing faith, really tough lady, kind of nothing gets under her skin kind of person. Rides a motorcycle, does amazing ministry with the poor, and nothing shakes her faith. She's just one of those people who has no doubts about who God is. And she had told me that she was having hernia repair surgery. And I didn't write it down, just a bad idea. And in my mind, I subconsciously filed it under not life-threatening, probably outpatient surgery. And I forgot when she had her surgery. And it wasn't until a week later that she called me, and she gave me what for. And she dressed me up one side and down the other, and I deserved every bit of it because I had forgotten that she was having this surgery. And I begged for her forgiveness. I apologized. I spent a couple of days crying myself, beating myself up that I had done this and left her feeling uncared for by her pastor and by her church. And yes, I am honored to say that we continued to find a way forward together. And we worked it out. And we continued to be part of the same community of faith for many years after that had happened. Now, some people, in my experience, when someone in the church hurts their feelings or when the pastor screws up, they choose to go elsewhere, preferring to sweep their hurt and pain under the rug, rather than trying to find a way to work it out and to find reconciliation and healing. But the thing about sweeping such things under the rug is that after a while you have a really lumpy rug. At some point we have to be honest about how we are feeling and trust the relationships that we have in our covenant community, that God will find a way to bring healing to our hurts, forgiveness into our circumstances, and knit us back together as God's people. And judging by the community that Moses continued to lead through the wilderness, it would seem that they found a way to do just that. They found a way to work their way through their hurt and their pain and to continue to trust that God was building them up into a community of love and forgiveness. I remember several years ago, I was on a retreat. It was actually near the beginning of my ministry. And there was a newly retired pastor there who had been a pastor for 40 years. And he shared a story about how close he had become with his very first church that he had served. And then how much pain he had felt when near the end of his time there, something had happened and he felt like several of the people in the church had been really unfair to him and treated him badly. And what he shared on that retreat was, I vowed right then and there I would never get that close to another church family again. And I thought, wow, 40 years is a long time to guard your heart and not allow for the depth of that love and relationship to happen. And what I felt God do with me on the retreat that weekend was promise, Amy, if you continue to pour out your heart for God's people and form those kind of relationships, because love always involves vulnerability, then I promise to put you back together again every time you get hurt. And that's what God does. And so after I had been dressed down by my parishioner in my last place, I prayed and trusted that God would bring healing, and God always does. And isn't that the way it is in all of our relationships that we care about and care for deeply? That we work on our family relationships because they matter, because they are part of God's covenant faithfulness in our lives, and because there is nothing as beautiful as being a part of God's covenant community. This is the place where we come to share our joys and our sorrows, This is the place where we are bound together in the kind of relationships that carry us in ways that no other relationships are able to do. This is where we are able to find intimacy with God and relationship with one another. John Wesley was fond of saying there is no holiness but social holiness. In other words, it's impossible to be a Christian all by ourselves. We need other people on the journey with us. And so, as we enter into these membership vows again together today, which are our baptismal covenant vows, I invite you to pay close attention when we come to the part that all of the church family says. It's number 8 in our list of the liturgy, in which I ask you, will you nurture one another in the Christian faith and life and include these persons now before you in your care? And you will reply, with God's help, we will proclaim the good news and live according to the example of Christ. We will surround these persons with a community of love and forgiveness, that they may grow in their trust of God and be found faithful in their service to others. We will pray for them, that they may be true disciples who walk in the way that lead to life. There is nothing more beautiful than a community of faith in which we get to share the journey. This week, I was here on Wednesday night for Bible study, and one of our moms brought her little, not quite 2-year-old niece, Violet, to the Christian Ed meeting because she had to. And so as Violet came in, I said, "Oh, Violet, come sit with me." And I got to sit down, and Violet plopped her little self right in my lap. And we read books and talked about the characters in the story and what costumes Barbie was wearing in the storybook, etc. And we shared in some 2-year-old joy. And Violet's never going to remember that happened, not specifically. But we humans have something called learning memory. We may not remember how we learned 2 + 2 = 4, but we always remember that it does. And so it is with our experience of church from the earliest of days. We may not remember when we learn that the church is a place for us to be blessed, to be nourished by God's grace. But that truth always stays with us. And so, my dear church, I can always promise you my best and ask us to trust God for the rest. But I can also promise that there are going to be times when I am going to mess up, when I'm going to sin, when I'm going to do something differently than perhaps it should be done. And when those times come, the most I can ask is that we bear with one another and trust the love of God to bring us into reconciliation again. Indeed, that is how our community flourishes, that we trust one another to work things through in the spirit of love. And even though it may seem easier to walk away, it is much more fulfilling and blessing and sustaining to remain in covenant faithfulness with God's people, for it is in this way that we experience the abundance of life and joy that God has for us. Thanks be to God. Amen. At this time, we are indeed blessed to receive Alberta Argy and Brian and Marianne Stratton into membership. And so as they come forward,